Hello and welcome back to the Toffee Blues YouTube channel. This is your source for all things Everton. My name is Thomas Robertson, back today with the ESC. Of course, this has been a pretty busy week so far. Footballing results aside, Everton have now got 4 points back of their 10-point deduction, lifted us slightly further away from the relegation zone. But if Luton had beaten Villa the other night, it basically would have seemed like we didn't gain much of an advantage at all. But Paul, first of all, thank you for joining me. And how are you doing today?
I'm not too bad, mate, given that I'm an Evertonian. I think I've spoken to. It's still quite early in the morning here, but I've spoken to 4 Evertonians this morning, and every single one of them have apologised for how they're feeling. So this probably says it all, really, doesn't it, about how everybody is currently feeling.
Yeah, I mean, I think we're lucky we've got plenty of games left. Something that might have a hindrance on that is the next sanction, but we will get to that later. We may as well start with your initial reaction when the news broke that we got the penalty was reduced to 6 points.
Um, I'm not sure I was massively enthused by it, to be honest. I think it laid bare. Well, first of all, I think we should say that the appeal board seemed to have conducted itself in a far better manner than the original commission did. And I think our representation of our case was much better second time round. But actually, when you look at it from this single perspective, we had 9 points to make in terms of defending or appealing against the original decision, 7 of which related to the club and its mitigating circumstances, or the mitigating circumstances that led to the charge, and 2 of which related to how the commission itself had conducted itself or been constructed. We failed on all 7 of, for want of a better term, our points. So not one of the 7 points with regards to mitigation was accepted by the appeals board. So I think that forebodes very badly for the next one going forward, because it seems to me that the Premier League, Independent Commission, and indeed the appeal on this occasion don't put much faith in mitigating circumstances. Let's hope that they don't put much faith in aggregating circumstances neither. But we did, even though we presented it, I think, much better on this occasion. The fact is that all of our mitigating points failed to move the needle. The only thing that moved the needle in terms of going from 10 points to 6 points penalty was the 2 legal errors that the commission made. And those legal errors were, 1, accusing the club of a breach of utmost good faith, Rule B15, when that wasn't on the charge sheet. So it should never have been considered by the commission. There was no discussion about it beforehand. Everton weren't asked to prepare a case against it, but nevertheless, it was part of the original commission's consideration when they gave us the 10-point penalty. And that was found by the appeal board to be an error in law, because we weren't actually ever charged with that breach of that particular rule, B15. And then secondly, of course, and I suppose this is the one that grabs the most attention, is the fact that the Premier League in itself didn't have a prescribed tariff, and still doesn't have a prescribed tariff in terms of, what is the penalty if you breach the profitability and sustainability rules. The only thing that was established as a result of the appeal was that fairly firm now that a breach of profitability and sustainability rules, and I know most Evertonians will argue against this, but it's firmly established now that such a breach, i.e. you spend more money than you should do, results in a sporting advantage. Whether you actually use that advantage or not sensibly is a different matter. Quite clearly we didn't, because we finished 16th rather than projected 6th. in the third year of the period. But it is clear now that if you've breached profitability and sustainability and you're found guilty, A, there's a sporting sanction. It is a sporting sanction that's applied. And B, the starting point is 6 points. So we know going into, and we'll talk about it, I'm sure, we know going into the second charge that the Premier League believe that we've broken profitability and sustainability. If they manage to prove their case, or if we don't defend our case, if we accept that we have, because that's the other thing, Everton accepted everything that was said about them in the appeal. We didn't challenge any of the previous assumptions that had been made. If we go into the second charge with the same approach, that we don't challenge whatever it is that the Premier League, whatever the figures are that the Premier League are coming up with, then we know that we're starting from a 6 point sporting sanction perspective. The only question then, well, there's two questions that result from that, is there any consideration for the 2 years in which that we've already been penalised? If that is the case, does that mean that the sanction is reduced by 2/3? So a 6 point penalty becomes 2 points. And then whether anything more is added to it as a result of however much it is that we've actually gone over the profitability and sustainability limit. So yes, it was nice to get the four points back, but I think it establishes the fact that we're in a very difficult position going into the second charge.
Yeah, definitely. I think everyone's reaction to the news would have been very much based on maybe what they expected to get back, what they hoped to get back, and we always knew that the punishment, there would be some sort of punishment, because, as he said, we didn't go into it denying the fact that we had breached the rules. We went in with mitigating factors, and I mean, personally, I'd resign myself to getting nothing back. I think as the process had drawn out, I think I just kind of wore myself down to imagining that we'd get nothing back and we'd be stuck with this 10-point penalty. But we always knew that on the face of it, it looked quite harsh. I think that was, I'd like to say that was the opinion of, I'd say, most football fans, considering that the penalty for administration is 9 points. For the breach that we were punished for,
Can I just jump in there if you don't mind? The Premier League's view on the sanction for administration, which is 9 points, is that it's 9 points. It's immediate. There's no discussion about it. There's no way that you can appeal against it. It's automatic. And their view is that if you do go into administration, it's likely that you will have broken the financial rules anyway. So therefore, further penalties will probably apply. And as such, I actually don't buy into the argument that 9 points is the limit, and because administration is the worst possible thing that can happen, you can't possibly be penalised by more than 9 points. I don't buy that argument personally. So was 10 harsh? Probably it was, but I don't think it was harsh just because administration is 9 points.
Would you say that 6 is fair?
Well, I would argue strongly against the idea that a sporting sanction should apply, but that argument's been lost now, and it's established that it is a sporting sanction. So, they're the conditions upon which we have to operate in the future. So, there's nothing more that can be said and done about that. That's just the rules, and that's. We've still got this situation where the Premier League rules say that that the Commission has the ability to determine for itself what the appropriate sanction is. But the sanctions now are being firmed up in terms of, whilst there isn't a formula, and whilst the Premier League and the Premier League clubs argued against there being a formula, by virtue of the appeals hearing and decision, there has to be a formula. or at least there has to be a starting point, because it was established that by not having such, the commission had erred in law. So the appeal was saying, yeah, we hear what you're saying, Premier League, and we hear what you're saying, member clubs, but for this sanction policy to actually work, there has to be some formula, there has to be some sort of regulated approach to what you're going to be charged with. And that's now established, and that will be the case going forward. So it will be the case for us, and it will certainly be the case for Nottingham Forest as well.
Why is it that you don't think a sporting sanction is appropriate? Would you opt for something more like a transfer embargo or a fine? Why is it that a sporting penalty is? I mean, we can all see that we didn't gain a sporting advantage, but I guess there's no way that you can necessarily measure that later on. It can't really influence your decision. But why would you say that a sporting sanction isn't really the best way of dealing with it?
Well, it comes back to the precedent that was set in the West Ham United and Tevez case, where it was acknowledged that the people who suffer most are not the people who are guilty of let's use the word crime. It's obviously not a crime. The people who are guilty of the crime or guilty of the offence. I think the clubs have to accept responsibility, and that should be a monetary fine, some form of financial fine. And I'd go one stage further. I understand entirely, the principles of why you set up a football club, or indeed any entity, as a company, because it reduces any liability of the directors. But I actually think the directors and the owners should be held in some way personally responsible for running the club in the manner in which they have, not the fans or the players or the people who work for the club. Because let's remember, if we were to get relegated because of the points penalty, be it the first or the second charge, it impacts so many people's lives. Innocent people who've got nothing at all to do with the decisions that were taken, which resulted in us losing more money than we were allowed to do so. And that seems to me to be grossly unfair. The people who made the decisions is the owner and the directors, and they should be in some way held responsible. Now, you'd probably end up in a situation where very few people would want to be a director of a football club if you could construct a system that says you are personally liable for the situations such as this, for the losses that that result from being found guilty. But there's no reason at all why owners, and especially given the type of investors that are coming into football now, big institutions or indeed state funds, there's no reason at all why owners couldn't put up like a good behavior bond. So they put up a bond of 10, 20, 30, 40, 50 million, whatever the figure is. You'd have to work out what the appropriate figure is. And if a club behaves in the way that Everton did behave and is so lax and ignores the warnings of the Premier League and just carries on regardless, reckless was the word that was used, then that good behaviour bond, the penalty is taken out of that, as against the penalty is taken out of the fans, the people that work for the club, or indeed the community around the club itself. It just seems to me that we're penalising the wrong people, and that's the only reason for not having a sporting, in my view, not having a sporting sanction. That we have to recognise who the real culprits are here. And it's not the football.
And unfortunately, the Premier League only decided to do that with the Super League clubs. Of course, when they fined them a measly sum in the end, apparently part of that was because they didn't want to punish the fans. Where obviously that just went out the window in this case, and it may do again towards the end of the season. But if we get more back into the detail of the appeal, as you mentioned, seven mitigating factors, as you said, were you did say earlier on that you were more maybe impressed with the approach that we took this time. What was it about the approach that we took that, in your opinion, was much better than the first hearing?
I mean, it just seemed more professional. It seemed more realistic, and if mitigation was to be taken into account, it just seemed like a more realistic approach to mitigation. You know, in the first hearing, the idea that we could claim, for example, that the youth levy that's applied to transfers could count towards youth expenditure and therefore not part of the profitability and sustainability rules. You know, stuff like that is just it's so desperate. Okay, nobody had ever tried it before. We tried it, and I suppose you could argue, well, there's no harm in trying. But actually, it's sort of it becomes if the mitigation circumstances are so poor, they almost become aggravating factors, don't they? So I think that there was a better approach to it this time, and it was an approach more grounded in fact than one might almost just say hope on the first occasion.
And as you mentioned before, a big part of the appeals findings was about the club acting in good faith. So why was it initially that we were found to have not done that? And how much of an impact did that then have on the sanction then being reduced?
So in the first commission hearing, they talked about Everton being less than frank, which is not a legal term. I mean, you don't have to be frank when you're defending yourself. There's no compulsion to give all of the information that's available to you. You just give what you think is appropriate in order to defend your position, as long as that information is accurate and correct, and there's no implied dishonesty within that information. You're free to give as much or as little as you want. So the idea that we were less than frank is a very strange notion. There's no legal basis at all for that. So that was the first point. The second point was that the original commission hearing accepted that there was no intent to be dishonest. So that in itself sort of puts a question mark over why is this a factor in the penalty that we received in the first instance. And then finally, and you know, this is a procedural thing, nobody had ever actually beforehand accused us of not acting with utmost good faith. So, you know, to try and sort of contextualize it, it's like in the middle of a criminal trial, the prosecution just throwing a new offence at the defence when it's never been discussed beforehand. And the absurdity of it is that the first commission accepted it and actually, you know, drew a conclusion against it. Why Everton were unable to defend that position at the time is a bit of a mystery. But obviously, in the appeal, once a point was made that, look, we were never charged with this. So first of all, that's against the Premier League rules, the fact that it was taken into consideration. And secondly, you know, what does less than frank mean? It was always going to fail. So if that was an aggravating factor, and of course in the original commission it was considered to be an aggravating factor, it was dismissed out of hand, completely dismissed. So we were always going to get something back on that basis.
Why would Premier League clubs, when profitability and sustainability was being brought in and voted on, why would they kind of opt for no kind of punishment framework? Why leave it so open-ended where we can end up in situations like this where we're deducted 10, we then, well, we didn't technically get fall back, but the reduction, the point deduction was changed at 6 points. Why would Premier League teams want there to be such a kind of open-ended scale for punishment for profitability and sustainability crimes?
I think it comes from a lack of confidence in the regulatory position of the Premier League. Because the Premier League is a member-owned entity, i.e. the 20 Premier League clubs are, whoever they are at any given time, they're the shareholders, they're the owners of the Premier League. I think they felt, they being the Premier League board, that it was very important for the commission to be seen as independent as possible. Therefore, you have the rules, and we've made a charge against you that you've broken the rules. Then everything else is left to the independent commission. Remember how much emphasis there used to be on the word independent. And it was because they didn't, I think it was because they didn't have enough confidence in their own governance and their own structures to say, actually, we can still be a member-owned entity and still apply our own sanctions or limits to whatever the penalties should be. I think there's possibly a danger that some of the bigger clubs, who probably are well, I mean, Chelsea may well be, and Manchester City might, but are less likely, one would think, to be caught by PSR rules, because they're making a judgment on what the penalty should be, that perhaps there's some implied unfairness in that, and therefore they were very, very keen for it to be seen as independent and to be seen to be totally separate to the Premier League itself. Does that make sense?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, I just think kind of without that context, it seems almost baffling that clubs would really want there to be kind of no limit on what punishment or what kind of punishment anyway. So that did seem quite bizarre, but that is a good clarification. And you've already mentioned there that now for the next sanction, 6 points is obviously the starting point. Well, actually, before we get onto ourselves, we may as well start with Nottingham Forest, because there's plenty that I'm sure we'll get into double jeopardy, the fact that we're being punished for a similar time period, we're plus 1 year. If you're Nottingham Forest right now, what would your reaction kind of be to that appeal hearing, knowing that now the starting point's definitely 6, and then they don't necessarily have, well, they don't at all have the argument that we may present when the time comes?
I think they just have to accept they're in a really difficult position, and it seems almost impossible to think. Well, I certainly can't think of a viable strategy to mitigate, their behaviour. They quite clearly were as reckless as Everton were, albeit in slightly different circumstances. They have an owner that comes in and's got lots of money. He decides to ignore the rules, and he decides to spend, vast sums relative to Nottingham Forest's income, therefore creating huge losses. And he will argue that it's on the basis of he wants to stay in the Premier League, and therefore he has to spend this money in order to have a competitive squad. Sort of same sort of argument that Mashiri used in terms of, I have to spend this money because, I mean, what a ridiculous statement he made. I have to spend this money because we've got no midfield. So I think that Nottingham Forest are in a really difficult position, because it is, as it now appears, to be totally indefensible. It's a clear message to any Premier League club, current or future Premier League club, that if you break these financial rules, you are going to be harshly punished. So it draws a clear. If it wasn't clear beforehand, even if the rules were there to be read and written, it's very clear from this point forward. This is what will happen if you're a penny over the 105 million limit.
Yeah, I mean, they should definitely be worried But going back to our case, what would you say is the best case that we can put forward now? Clearly, there's not much room for mitigation. Do you think our argument will mainly factor on the fact that it is slightly double jeopardy and they've only added one more year to a period we've already been punished for?
I think the double jeopardy argument is obviously one that we're going to use. I can't remember the term. There is another legal term that actually probably will be used. It's escaped my old brain, because it's not really double jeopardy, because that relates to criminal cases as against what is effectively a civil case. But it effectively means the same thing, that you can't be punished for the same thing twice. It's just a slightly different legal term. So that will be a big part of what our defence will be. But the counter argument, and I don't need to present the Premier League's argument really, because they'll do it for themselves, is that you went into the third year of the latest 3-year cycle knowing exactly what your position was, and yet you still continue to behave in a what will be considered to be a reckless manner, because you didn't take into account that your behaviour was likely to take you over the £105 million limit. So I think it's extraordinarily difficult to argue against the fact that if we did go over the limit, we went over the limit, and we did so willingly and in full knowledge of doing so. It's really, you can be, and we're all passionate Evertonians, and we all will try and dream up, all the reasons why this shouldn't happen to Everton, blah, blah, blah. But at the end of the day, this is a reflection of the recklessness of Farhad Moshiri. It's not the rules per se, or indeed the Premier League, who, there's a degree of fault, yes, and they've obviously presented their case very badly. But ultimately, it's Farhad Moshiri's responsibility, nobody else's.
Yeah, absolutely. And we're not going to get into 777 now. I think that would maybe just make this conversation even more dreary and depressing. But my final question is, I know that you don't have a crystal ball. I think the 10 points last time was unexpected. I think that probably caught everyone off guard. 6 points is maybe more along the lines of what I originally anticipated. But are you slightly more hopeful going into this second breach, not only because of the fact that it's now been reduced to 6 points, but we do seem to be better represented than we were the first time?
I think we'd be better prepared, and obviously we are going to be better represented, because we're going to carry the same barrister forward. I think we've got a strong case to argue that we've already been penalised for 2 of the 3 years, therefore only 1/3 of the sanction should apply, which means 2 points. And then it's just a question of whether the Premier League think that our behaviour and the recklessness of our behaviour means that we should have additional points added to those 6, which would then become 2. So I think we will end up somewhere between 2 and 4 points. And the difference between the 2 and the 4 points is essentially the Commission's view as to how reckless or not we were in that third year. So we could end up back, with a cumulative 10 points based on the 6 that we've already had, and maybe as many as 4 on this second charge.
Yeah, and that difference between 2 and 4 points could be absolutely massive in the relegation battle. Of course, if Forest get punished as well, that's definitely going to help our case, but we'll have to see how that one develops. I'm sure we'll get plenty of time to talk about that as well. But Paul, as always, thank you very much for joining me. If our listeners want to find any more of you, where can they find you?
The ESC, either on Twitter or the ESC.org, which is my website, and just there basically.
And thank you all very much for listening. If you enjoyed, make sure you like the video, give us a subscribe as well. Leave us your thoughts in the comments. Let us know how you are feeling about another potential point deduction later on in the season. As mentioned, thank you all very much for listening and join us next time on the Toffee Blues.